The old saying rings true. SCP fans want to watch SCP content. Apparently you were all digging our last SCP movie list, so we'll fire another one your way. Still no sign of big budget bonanzas, but the fan-made stuff is just as entertaining with only a fraction of the risk of selling out. Some are animated, some are put together like fancy slideshows, some attempt to replicate the feeling of a documentary. All I know is that SCP content that elaborates on the wiki is almost always a wicked good time. Hello horror heads and welcome back to the scariest channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. I'm your horror host Keegan Hughes, and today we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 SCP horror movies part 2. Make sure you've seen all of our SCP videos before diving too deep into new stuff. Our top 5 scary SCP playlist is right over here for your viewing pleasure. Alright, let's get started. Coming in at number 5, we've got SCP Site 22. Mr. Clay is back at it again, or I suppose back at it before. We featured his other famous SCP short film 096 in our last video in the number 1 spot. This almost seems like a practice round, but that doesn't mean it's not excellent. It just means that 096 is truly remarkable. Plus, Site 22 was made on a $100 budget with borrowed equipment. Righteous. We open on some chaos unfolding in the woods near a Foundation site. 2 security guards are on the run from something horrible. It seems as though a containment breach has rendered said site extremely dangerous, and the 2 dudes are really scared that they might be the only ones still left alive. Still, they've got to come up with a plan and figure out what to do next, before whatever took out the facility comes to take them out. Uh-oh. For a 7-minute short, there is a great deal of tension and terror packed in here. The 2 actors sell their roles pretty well and make for a compelling little story. Of course, the real star of the show is the escaped anomaly. They didn't do their jobs, and now it's no longer secured, contained, or protected. In fact, the Foundation personnel probably need to be protected at this point. On that same $100 budget, they also managed to add in a freaky CG monster and a fun little helicopter sequence too. While it might not delve super far into SCP lore or explore too much of the universe, it is a tight, punchy sci-fi horror short that gets right to the core of what some folks love about SCP. Coming in at number 4, we've got SCP Unremarkable. Judging by the name, you might not be super inclined to watch this one. Who wants to view something unremarkable? How are you going to remark upon it? But don't worry though, the name is illustrative of one of the character's anomalous qualities, not of the short itself. The story has been done before by a few different SCP content creators. It is the tale of SCP-1504, one Joe Schmo. Another unremarkable name, right? Well, you've probably heard this story before. It's a compelling read on the wiki, but writer-director Nevin Dove adapts it wonderfully to the screen. Clocking in at around 9 minutes, it's not the world's most intense watch, but it gets all it needs to out on the table. Poor Joe, he just wants someone to recognize him. We watch an interview play out in an old school TV, and nothing odd seems to happen. A doctor interviews 1504, acknowledges that he can't be harmed, asks him some basic question, and realizes he's run out of questions early before getting a nosebleed. 1504 answers all these questions amicably, and offers some theories as to why the doctor's nose is bleeding. However, when we zoom in and watch the interview from a new perspective, things change. Now we're seeing it from 1504's perspective. Not only can he not be harmed, but his actions can't be registered by anyone. He could punch a doctor in the face and the doctor would just assume he'd got a nosebleed for no reason, which is exactly what happens. This is another relatively simple short, but there's beauty in the simplicity. All it needs to work is 2 strong performances and a script that adapts the material well, which it has. It's a tragic tale with lots of imagination-stoking implications. It's not the scariest SCP movie until you realize that this SCP could hypothetically do anything, get away with it, and you would never know it. What would you do if you were anomalous like 1504? Coming in at number 3, we've got Lord Bung's Confinement. I'll admit it, this isn't a movie or even a short film. It's an animated series by the now beloved Lord Bung. All hail the Bung. I didn't think I'd ever be saying that in front of thousands of people. This creator is a true talent. I would not be surprised if they managed to score a gig working for a syndicated animated show. The fact that Confinement is SCP based is almost inconsequential to one's enjoyment of it. Of course, all of the anomalies and nods to Foundation culture are wonderful for fans, but the series of goofy, gory, and glib experiments and characters are just plain fun to watch. It focuses on the misadventures of an anomalous test subject known as Connor Sylvester. He's got regenerative immortality, so basically whenever he dies, he just reappears moments later, totally unscathed. The bodies of his previous lives remain though. He's put through gauntlet after gauntlet of SCP nonsense, from interviewing a Victorian cannibal to heading into the 093 dimension to retrieve a clipboard to the jokiest of joke SCPs. And all the anomalies are lovingly rendered in a way that makes them very believable. Unfortunately, because it's so funny, the scariest stuff isn't all that scary. I'm sure if you had no idea what you were getting into by watching this, some of it might disturb you. However, the target audience is definitely similar to one that would watch Adult Swim, so I don't know if anybody watching this would be underprepared. There are 7 episodes out right now, with an 8th in production as we speak. It starts out as a laugh, but introduces some pretty wicked plot points to keep the action alive and really develops the characters, so the audience stays engaged. Coming in at number 2, we've got Zap SCP. Speaking of series, there seems to be a lot of them on the list today. This one is put together by a Russian team, but don't worry, there are subtitles. It blends live-action recreations with all sorts of documentary-style readings of SCP entries to create a cool and creative project. There are 3 episodes of creepy international fun, with a 4th mini-episode if you just can't get enough. And it's got some scope, too. Lots of anomalies, lots of Foundation personnel, and lots of different scenarios. The whole experience feels a little larger than life, although that's true probably of most SCP content. It's definitely a little darker than some of the other stuff out there, with plenty of horrifying anomalous consequences for its characters. You can definitely feel the passion coming from this passion project. The man behind it, who goes by Zap, is a director/CG generalist, and he puts all of his creative muscles to work for this SCP series. While the budget might be scant, the creativity and commitment aren't. More proof that an SCP series would work extremely well, especially if there was some money to put behind it. But hey, maybe the old saying rings true: limitations encourage creativity. And coming in at number 1, we've got SCP First Contact. The glory days of machinima are long gone, but there are still plenty of digital filmmakers putting out some incredible stuff. Evan Royalty is one such individual. You might recognize his name from our last SCP Horror Movies list, putting together the spicy short known as SCP Dollhouse. That featured live-action performances, wicked special effects, and some real-life military tactics. First Contact predates Dollhouse and takes a less realistic approach. However, this approach works quite well when you consider the world it's taking place in. We follow a mobile task force well known for their skills and, unfortunately, their disposability as well. They're often tasked with making first contact with SCPs largely unknown to the Foundation. They have to be ready to take on any threat, no matter how big or small. The lack of certainty in their lives and jobs can lead to some unpredictable results. And those unpredictable results are the focus of this movie. Made in Grand Theft Auto 5 and utilizing the talents of all sorts of excellent voice actors, this is a movie that takes a look at the Foundation in ways that most people won't. Mobile task forces aren't just autonomous groups of skilled people following orders, they're squads of real people in tough situations. It's not based on any pre-existing SCP, but the forces MTF Omega Orange come up against fit right in with the rest of the universe. Keep it up, Mr. Royalty. Plenty more where that came from. After seeing all these, do you still have confidence that the Foundation can keep dangerous anomalies contained? Probably not, eh? That's just the reality of the situation, I suppose, or the surreality, if that's a thing. So what'd you think of the list? How many of these had you seen already? Do you think any of these ideas could be developed into something bigger? Is there an SCP movie that I missed? Make sure you let me know down in the comments. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of your more liquid ones from the top 5 horror shows that should have never been made. Teeny B says, I don't think Ghost Whisperer was supposed to be a horror series necessarily. I think it was supposed to be a melodrama with a supernatural element. It's not supposed to frighten, it's supposed to invoke emotions. Well, I may have stretched the definition a little, but when you throw ghosts into something so saccharine, you have to expect some raised eyebrows. Classic Diva 33 says they should have kept Channel 0. I came upon it years later after it had been cancelled, unfortunately. But the stories were really unique. I loved it. Me too, Classic Diva 33. Me too. The showrunner did work on Antlers though, so we've got some more Antasca charm, hopefully sometime soon. Andre Flores says the worst horror TV show I've watched recently was The Mist, a bafflingly stupid adaptation of Stephen King's classic. Honestly, I think the reason I didn't include it on the list was that I had completely purged any memory of it from my mind. Matthew Boyajian says, please do more theories like Ma and Scooby-Doo. Are you implying there's a connection between Ma and Scooby-Doo? Because I need to know about that theory, like right now. Keith Bosner says, my wife loves Ghost Whisperer, go to H-Money. That's a bit extreme, don't you think? Plus, if I died, I wouldn't be going to hell, I'd become a ghost, and then I'd get whispered. And that's all the time we have for today. Before I dive off the highest tower into a kiddie pool, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe for more horror hijinks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. And Heath Bosner says, my wife loves, Los Whisperer, wish, wish, wish. I'm your horror host, Keegan Hughes, and today we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 scary SCP horror movies. Nope. I'm your horror host, Keegan Hughes, and today we're going to take a look at the top 5 SCP... Woo! It's definitely... And those unpredictable results are the... It's not based on any pre-existing SCP, but the Forces MTF... Yep. After seeing all... Oh, excuse me.